Just as a little reminder, at the end of the last video, we mentioned that you should go ahead and for this current operation, or rather the operation to do, add some conditionals where if it's add, then go ahead and invoke some add function that you implement. If it's sub, go ahead and invoke some subtraction method. And these are going to be each different functions that you can define in your JavaScript code. And so I want to ask that you go ahead and pause the video if you haven't tried this before and give that a try before we work through it together. Okay, so hopefully you gave that a try. So let's go ahead and start by just creating our functions. So we'll have a function which we'll call like adder, and it will take in two arguments, a num1 and a num2. And then we'll have these curly braces, which is like the JavaScript equivalent of Python having that colon and then indentation. In JavaScript, you don't actually have to use indentation, but it makes code a lot easier to read, which is why in Python they force it. Okay, so in this case, we're just going to return num1 plus num2. We're going to do something very similar for subtraction, etc. So for instead of our adder, we'll have a subtractor, right? And then very similar for our last two functions. We have a multiplier, and you can call these things whatever you want. I just thought it would be a little bit better to give them unique names compared to our IDs to try to avoid kind of confusion there. All right, and then function divider. Okay, and so we've done all four of those. And now we need these conditional statements where based on what our operation to do is, we can go ahead and execute the right function. So we'll have an if statement. We've already seen one if statement up here when we were checking which operation to do. So we'll say if operation to do is equal to add. And then the other thing I didn't mention before, but in JavaScript, they require parentheses around your condition. I don't really know why, but I guess it makes it a little bit clearer and more comprehensible. And then we'll go ahead and add our, invoke the adder, and we'll pass in our num1 and num2. So one thing that might be a problem, by the way, is if you're, because we mentioned that these were inputs of type text, technically they could say 1A, maybe it's just like, you know, they sneeze or something and accidentally type a bunch of characters and then submit. And then that would be not correct and cause an error in the code where we try to like add these together. Or maybe it would just concatenate them like strings, but do something that we aren't expecting. So generally, whenever you receive user input, you want to validate that user input. So what we'll do is we'll, at the start of our Visual Studio code, or rather in our index.js, back when we were grabbing our num1 and num2, we'll go ahead and like kind of, we could write a function that says like validate, and that would save us some time, especially if you're going to do that exercise I mentioned of not just having two numbers, but allowing for a user to input like 3 or even 4 or 5 numbers and have the same operation carried out on all of them, and where you're doing like a for loop instead of this repetition like I did. In that case, you really would want to write a validator function. We're going to do this a little simpler, and we'll just say if num1 value, or if num1, and then we need to do some JavaScript equivalent. In Python, you would check is digit to check whether a string is numeric or not. I don't know what it is in JavaScript exactly, so we'll go ahead and look it up. So we'll go ahead and say JavaScript check if variable is a number. All right, and then there are a couple of kind of random things. Tutorials point, I think, is usually pretty good. Sometimes they have longer articles and you don't really, and they're just trying to like zap ad money from you. So we'll just not read too much. Okay, so there's a type of operator is definitely not what we're looking for, or at least I don't think it's what we're looking for. Okay, maybe it is though. So they are checking. Yeah, I don't think that's what we want. I think it's something that, we'll say maybe JavaScript, check if form input is a number. Be a little bit more specific this time. So maybe it is NAND. Check, test if a value is a number. Use type of x triple equal number. Is NAND function answers the question, blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, it seemed like that tutorials point thing maybe was correct. And what is up with this is NAND? Okay, I guess there are two different ways. So I guess this first way is a little bit more clear. So we'll go ahead and give that a try. And we'll find out pretty quickly if it works or not. So we'll do type of num1 triple equal to number. Actually, so if it's a number, we're happy. If it's not, then we want to trigger some sort of error. So we'll go ahead and say, we'll maybe send an alert and say first number, first input was not a number. And then we need to exit out of this block of code. And remember, even though this thing doesn't have a name, it is a function. So we can use the return keyword to return from our function. Okay, and then we can do something similar. We can say else if type of num2 not equal to number. And so again, this is why you might want to write this as like a validate function so that you don't have to duplicate code quite as much. And in this case, we'll say that the second input was not a number. Could also just mention that one of the inputs is not a number and let the user find it out. But generally, if you can add a little bit more direction, it helps with debugging as well as helps the user out. Okay, so let's go ahead and try submitting this. And interesting, it did not seem to care, even though, let's go check what num1 was over in our console. So we need to scroll all the way down for value. Unfortunately, it's way down there. All right, and so the value was 1 ASDF. And so I'm surprised that it didn't trigger our alert. Oh, maybe it's because I did that in JavaScript. No, I was doing that in JavaScript before for our last app. Yeah, okay, that's weird. Okay, so it didn't seem to care. So again, I wasn't sure that this tutorials point thing was correct. So let's just go ahead and click into this Mozilla developer doc. And so this one is saying like, oh, you should just use this isNAND thing. Okay, interesting. So I guess basically this isNAND thing, if it's, so NAND stands for, oh, I guess this makes sense. NAND stands for not a number. So if this is true, then it's not a number. So, okay. Whereas if it's false, then it would be okay. So let's switch that up. So we'll instead say is NAND, and then pass in num1. So if this is not a number, then we do want to execute this code. And so then we'll have something very similar over here is nan for num2. And so let's go ahead and give that a try. and submit query. Okay, first input was not a number, and then let's go ahead and correct our first one, and then mess with the second one. Ooh, interesting. Let's go ahead and refresh. Okay, so there's some sort of bug. So for okay, I must have a typo because we're getting an undefined error. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code. And can you see the issue? Go ahead and pause the video and try to understand why we got that error and and go ahead and try to fix it too. Okay, so the issue is that we tried to check if num2 was a number before we actually grabbed the value from the HTML. So instead of this else if, I mean, there are two different ways of doing this. One is we could just move this whole block of code down below num2. The other thing is that we don't really need this as an else if. We can just have it as an else. And then we can go ahead and copy paste just this block of code down below our num2 section. Okay, so let's go ahead and save and give that another try. Okay, much better. Second input was not a number. So again, this is something that generally is good whenever you implement something. It's best to go ahead and give it little tests. If you wait until the very end to do your tests, then it can be, you might have to do a lot of refactoring. It ends up adding a lot more time compared to implement little things, test, implement little things, test. And I might not have been doing the best job of that in the earlier part of this video in terms of building the HTML form. But under the hood, I was actually testing things a lot before I actually had the kind of, part of the video that I was willing to share with you all. Okay, so the next thing to do is to, assuming that they actually give you numbers like we want, we want to actually create some alert message maybe that says that the result is 3 or whatever the result is of the addition, subtraction of whatever operation that is. So let's go ahead down here and we need to write our conditional statement. So we have our functions. We have our conditional statement for add. Go ahead and try filling those in for sub, mult, divide. Okay, so hopefully you paused the video. If you didn't, go ahead and pause it now and give that a try. So we're going to add an else if operation to do sub, and then we're going to call our subtractor num1, num2. We're going to add in, so I have to add a space. In some other language, I think it's Solidity, you can write them literally right next to each other. But in JavaScript, apparently they want a space between the else and the if. Okay, and then multiply. Forgot these semicolons. All right, and then last one, the operation to do divide. Num1, num2. Okay, and so then you notice that I wrote this if, else if, else if, else if. We could just have separate ifs, but the benefit of these else ifs is that we're really only expecting the user to do one operation at a time on the numbers. And there's a potential issue that could arise, which I guess we'd have to really open up that form again, but in the very beginning, none of these were selected. So if the user didn't select any of these, then there would be a problem. So think about how you could, notice that in your JavaScript code and send a helpful alert. So go ahead and pause the video and give that a try. Okay, so the way that we can do that is just by adding an else in this case. So we add an else, and then we send an alert. Did you forget to select an operation? So that's what should have happened. We'll go ahead and say maybe unknown operation in case there's something else weird that happens. Like maybe at some point we add in like the HTML, we add like a exponentiation option, or we add some other thing. Then it's not actually the user's fault, then it's our fault. So the unknown operation part is useful. And then right now this is correct. Okay. And then there's one other error in this code. So go ahead and try to correct that error, and go ahead and add the alert in case you know, our operation that we called was successful and we want to tell the user the correct value. So go ahead and pause the video and try to finish this off in the JavaScript. Okay, so the thing that I forgot is to actually get a result which we want to declare outside of our like if, else if. This has to do with scope. If you do a let like value here, then I mean that could be okay. You could just alert inside of this if statement, but it'd be kind of repetitive code. And if you instead wanted to do the let value and then alert out here, unfortunately it wouldn't know what your value is. You could do that with a var, I guess. So we'll remove the let part and we'll put it up here. Maybe we'll call this result to be a little bit more descriptive. And so, okay, so I'm doing a let. Now, what are the other two options for how we could declare this result variable? Think about that. And then why do we choose a let? Those are two kind of questions for you to think about. So go ahead and pause the video and try to write those in a comment right here. Okay, so the other options for variable declaration, those are const and let and var, and these are written in order from kind of like most or like least malleable to most malleable. So the var, you can change it. Its scope is global by default. Let, you can change the value, but it stays local to whatever block of code you set that let in. Const is also local like let, but you cannot change the value. All right, so the reason why we chose a let is because we want to have this value accessible outside of these if else ifs, and var is considered kind of like, people say that you should never have vars because then it's global in scope. The reason for that is if we have some other function, then it'd get really confusing if we actually have that result show up in our other function that's not expecting it. And a const would not be appropriate because then we couldn't change the value depending on which one of these things we actually called. All right, so I just need to save the value of whichever function we ended up calling. And then out here, we can do our alert. We'll say your result is, and then the value of the result. And then, oops, so this alert is not like console.log. It just wants one string passed. We saw that in our last video series. So we'll go ahead and say string, make sure that this is a string, and then add our semicolon at the end, semicolon here. Okay, and then we'll go ahead and save and give this full thing a try now. All right, so let's go ahead and submit query. That didn't work. So one thing is that we forgot to refresh. So let's give that another try. And we got your result is 12. So that's interesting. So we have a bug somewhere. So go ahead and pause the video and try to understand why we got 12 instead of 3. And go ahead and try to correct the error if you can find it too. Okay, so we've seen this happen in Python a couple of times now, I believe. So this happens when you have two strings and you add them instead of two numbers. So when you add two strings, they just get stitched together. So 1 plus 2 for strings is just 1, 2, or 12 we might read it as. And so the issue is that these are not actually being treated as numbers but as strings. And so one thing that we can do There are a couple of different ways to do this. Probably the easiest way is back where we defined our num1 and num2. We can cast these to maybe after we check that they're a number. We'll say num1 is equal to number of num1. And we'll want to do something very similar for num2. Oops. Okay. And then we need to change both these num1s to num2. So again, be a little bit nicer in a loop where we don't have to duplicate our code quite as much. All right, and then let's go ahead and give that another try. Remember, you have to refresh, submit query, and result is 3. That's much better. Okay, and so let's go ahead and try multiplying instead. Now this is going to point out kind of a problem that we have, which is that now we have 2 of these radio buttons selected. And so this is really an error more of on our side. If we submit query, we got result is 2. Okay, so actually this thing was smart and multiplied them instead of adding them. But still, there's a problem with our front end where we have like 2 things selected. If we click on the subtract, I don't actually know. Okay, so it's choosing multiply each time for some reason. But so this is a problem. And so this is related to that e.prevent default, which I didn't really explain, but the Mozilla developer docs does a good job of it. So you can go ahead and take a look if you want a little bit more understanding. But basically, the prevent default stops basically some code from having its default value. So we're going to go ahead and go back to our JavaScript and basically clear those fields after we do that alert message, so that when they click on a radio button a subsequent time, then we actually get the correct operation.